Okay, here we're going to cover some graphics questions, namely questions 29, 30, and 31 from section 1 of test 9. So here we see that all of these questions are focused on figure 1 and figure 2 of the passage up here. So let's just go view those for a second. We know the strategy on figure questions. First is to make sure you're paying attention to the titles of the graphics and the axis labels. And as you can see here, the challenge of figure 1 and of figure 2 is really in the title and in the axis labels, because the graph itself is really just a simple bar graph. So we have to really understand what the content that is being described in figure 1 is, and same for figure 2. And the titles will provide those. So in figure 1, we have the mean number of offspring compared to both the high and the low predation environments in the north and the south. So we've got kind of two variations here: south with high, south with low. So south high, south low, and then north high and north low. So we're trying to figure out what do we see here. So first thing I would always do when looking at these on my initial read is just see what kind of pattern I notice. So I'm definitely noticing that it isn't the south versus the north that has the variation, but rather where we have high predation environment, we have, whether you're in the south or the north, you seem to have a higher number of guppies being born, okay? So more predators in the environment equal more guppies being born, regardless of whether you're on the south slope or the north slope. So that's kind of the initial idea that you have to take away from that graph. Similarly, here we need to see, okay, the mean embryo mass. So, what's the average weight, for lack of a better word? Mass and weight are obviously not the same, but for purposes here, we can kind of assume that. And we have, again, the variation doesn't seem to be between north and south, but rather between high predator environment and low predator environment. Where we have a low environment, low predators, then we seem to have higher mass of the embryos being born. So we kind of take that general information back with us to these questions and see where we go. So 29, we just really, it's a very literal read of the graph. We can see here that if we go back to the graph, the guppies living in the south produced a mean offspring. So we need south high predator, and we just basically need to find out where that is. If we go here, south high predator, we can see right away that if we're in the south with the high predator, we are right about 6.5. And so we get that one pretty simply. I hope that's a question that most of you can get, and really I would just use it as a review to just really anticipate one question that's a very basic read of the graph. Moving to 30, we really here are just being asked to understand what is figure 2 showing us about the mean mass of the guppy embryos. And if you read the graph as we did above, you really can seem to, get this answer pretty quickly because we saw that it wasn't the slope north or south, but rather the number of predators in the environment that was really making the difference. So if you understand that concept, then C really should jump out to you as the answer. And again, if you're ever reading answers and trying to make them work with the graph, then you're really wasting your time. Rather, I would highly recommend you look at the graph and you make sure you understand that, and then you search for the answer that makes sense. It's a lot of wasted time to take an answer, try to understand it, then go back to the graph and see if it works, because it's like you're taking time on something that's wrong. Whereas it makes a lot more sense just to look at the graph, be sure you understand it, given that we know the graph is correct, and then figure out what your answer would be, what's the basic gist, and find that in the answer choices. Finally, with question 31, and these do usually go up in difficulty as you go for a graphic. If there are 3 graphic questions together, often the first is easier and they get increasingly more difficult. That's not always the case, but more often than not. And so really this last question, you could probably guess, is going to ask you to combine the information that you see in both figure 1 and figure 2. And if you've already done that and tried to understand them, then again, the answer should kind of jump out to you here, because as we see in 1 and 2, we're seeing guppies from low predation environments are more likely to first come from a smaller litter because there are fewer number of offspring being produced. We see that from figure 1. And then they should also have a greater mean embryo mass, and we see that from figure 2. So you could definitely just think of each of these answers as 2-part answers, and at least like work with one at a time. That's one tip for you, is to kind of see this, kind of split them here and analyze the first part first. And then you can kind of decide, so like these aren't going to make much sense on the first, right, for the first part. So you'd really then just be left, having to analyze the second part. And then that doesn't make any sense for A, leading us to B. So that is a pretty challenging question, but I hope you've noticed at this point that if you're spending the time grounding yourself and investing in an understanding of the graphs up front, then it will pay off when you get to the questions.